Good morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Teaming up, the EU looks to join forces with nations hit by President Trump's tariffs while delaying its own countermeasures against the United States to allow more time for talks. Equity futures retreat in a cautious start to the week after Trump's latest tariff ultimatums, including 30% on the EU and Mexico. And South African President Cyril Ramaphosa suspends his police minister, launching an inquiry into allegations of sabotage in a probe of political killings. It has just gone 8 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Jumana Versace, back in Dubai after a couple of weeks away. It's good to be back here, everybody. But once again, the focus is on tariff. This time, we've got new letters that have been sent out to Mexico and to the EU, floating a potential tariff rate of 30% that could get kicked in as soon as August the 1st. So, of course, a couple of weeks away still. Maybe we get a negotiation or a deal in the interim. That being said, more and more letters, despite the fact that both of those blocs, both the EU and Mexico, were actually engaged in trade negotiations with the U.S., did not stop the Trump administration from raising the tariff threat to 30%. So this is the reaction on markets this morning. S&P futures down 0.4%. This after falling 0.3% on Friday. Not a great week, actually, for Wall Street last week, with the S&P ending the week down about 0.3% weaker versus European markets, which for the week last week actually ended stronger, up 1.8%. But you can see quite clearly this morning the European futures are signaling a more negative start, down 0.6% on back of the latest tariff news. 10-year yield sitting at 4.41. We moved up about 7 basis points throughout the course of trade on Friday. More and more focus on fiscal, both for U.S. yields, but also for JGB yields, as well as we've been speaking about with our Asian colleagues. As we head into quite a crucial week in terms of data, don't forget, earnings season kicks off. Wall Street expecting the weakest reporting season since mid-2023, so watch out for that, as well as all of the other big data events that we get, including US CPI and China GDP. Brent, you can see, sitting just above $70 now, up 0.2%. And by the way, surprisingly, the energy sector was the best performing sector in the S&P last week. Switching over, I just want to show you this terminal chart that we put together, or essentially a chart highlighting how low expectations are going into this quarter's earnings. And so we have it coming in. The estimates, two-quarter earnings, the second quarter earnings are projected to rise just 2.8%. That is the lowest level since June 2023, so in a couple of years. So the bar is very, very low indeed. Okay, let's also check in on how markets in Asia are faring. Yvonne Mann is in Hong Kong. Yvonne, great to have you with us on the show. A bit of green, I would say, in the handover from Asia, and perhaps because no new tariff news has come out there?
Yeah, not quite. And you know, we got the data from China in just the last few hours or so. And this is, of course, the trade data for June. And it was actually looking better than expected. If you take a look at exports and imports, both beating expectations. In fact, exports are up close to 6%, 5.8% to be exact. And that's actually ramping up for the first time since March. Yes, you got to wonder, is it because of front loading and that we are seeing in the midst of this 90-day truce between the U.S. and China that people are ramping up exports at this time? But for the most part, the signal seems to be that things are carrying on and holding up for now the data right now in China. So this is a pretty interesting sort of gauge before we get that big data dump tomorrow, as you alluded to, that GDP number out of China. So second quarter estimates, according to a survey, is 5.1. That brings us for the first half of China growth there this year to be around 5.3. So according to economists, that's still well above China's target in some ways. So maybe that eases the pressure when it comes to policymakers, when it comes to policy and more stimulus moving forward. So, but again, it's a very sort of fragile sort of recovery. We take a look at how, of course, we're in the midst of this trade truce. There's also these consumption subsidies, which seem to be fading, or at least the expectation is for the second half. The rest of Asia is looking like this. You broaden it out. We are pretty wobbly when it comes to the equity space here for the most part, just given those headlines that you mentioned about Mexico, about the EU. So stocks are pretty much flat here right now. China seems to be still standing out, though. A-share market is up about 1/5 of 1% on the CSI 300. You are seeing a little bit of a bid when it comes to the havens like the yen here, although that's come off a bit here as well. But you mentioned about Bitcoin, watching the likes of silver prices as well. Spot silver is at the highest we've seen since 2011. Some of these silver stocks are surging here. This one, Hunan Silver, based in China, is up some 9%.
Yeah, quite substantial. But I guess the main takeaway is that the China data is coming in slightly better than expectations. All eyes on that GDP print. Yvonne Mann, great to have you with us. Thank you so much. Now, President Trump says the U.S. is currently negotiating trade deals across the EU and other nations, meaning the tariff rates he's threatening could yet change.
So the European Union is talking to us. They want to open up their country. I would say Japan to a much lesser extent in terms of opening up their country. South Korea wants to make a deal other than tariffs. Right now, as you know, they're paying a substantial tariff, but they want to make a difference. So some of these deals, maybe I'll change them and maybe I won't.
That comes after he unleashed his latest tariff ultimatums, threatening a 30% rate for the EU and Mexico from August the 1st. For more, let's bring in senior editor Bill Ferries. Bill, on Friday, we were talking about all these letters that the Trump administration had been sending out and talking about perhaps how the EU had been spared for the time being because they were engaged in negotiations with Trump around a potential baseline rate of 10%. He obviously surprised them over the weekend by insinuating it could go as high as 30%. How disruptive could that be for the EU?
Yeah, it's hard to know whether this is really Trump narrowing in on what he thinks his final offer will be, or just expressing some frustration at perhaps where the state of the negotiations are. Obviously, as we were talking last week, there was a lot of discussion between the EU and the U.S. about having a flat rate, but then having different rates for some clear or key sectors. So there was talk about German automobile makers who have factories in the U.S. getting perhaps a lower tariff rate. There was talk about alcohol exports from the EU getting some kind of a different rate, pharmaceuticals. So for the U.S. president to come in here over the weekend and just say, it's going to be a 30% flat rate, suggests some frustration. But as he said in that clip you played there, maybe he'll change his mind. Maybe he won't. There's still more than 2.5 weeks to go before August 1st. In the White House world, that is a lifetime in terms of being able to negotiate different terms. So the road is still somewhat long, and there might be a lot more whiplash ahead in the coming couple weeks.
Yeah, you say there's a couple of weeks is a long time in the Trump administration. It's difficult to believe it's only been 6 months of the Trump administration. But let's also speak about Mexico. They also received one of those letters. And how is Mexico responding to the threat of a similar set of tariffs? But there, of course, the main issue is fentanyl.
Yeah, that's right. The 30% tax rate the president announced also applying to Mexico, although perhaps not on a wide range of goods included in that USMCA trade deal with Mexico, the U.S., and Canada. President Claudia Sheinbaum so far to having a pretty relaxed reaction to this, saying that, listen, a lot of countries have gotten these letters. We have a good negotiating team. They're going to continue talks. I think she's taking the slightly longer view of there's still plenty of time to negotiate. April 2nd became June 9th, and that's become August 1st. So there is still perhaps some additional steps in this process ahead of everyone.
Yeah, Bloomberg's Bill Ferries, thank you so much. To pick up the conversation on how this is affecting markets, Aberdeen senior research economist Sree Kochugovindan joins us right now. Sree, good to have you with us. So it must be really difficult as an economist, as an analyst, as a trader to price in the tariff premium, namely because things keep changing, they're fluid, the deadlines keep moving. But in the case of the EU, if we actually do end up with a 30% tariff baseline, that would be detrimental, quite detrimental for the European economy. I've seen some analysts downgrade their growth forecasts already over the weekend by as much as 1%. How are you looking at it?
I think there's a number of different aspects here. First of all, as we've already heard, will these tariff rates that we heard last week, there was a whole flurry of letters last week, will they actually hold? Will the deadline change again? And I think that's partly what's being factored into the market pricing as well. Last week, despite all of the letters and despite some of the disappointments with Europe, Europe actually started quite well last week until these comments. I think what we're seeing in the market is a bit of a taco trade continuing, and maybe perhaps a bit of complacency for now that this is just part of the noise. This is going to continue into August, possibly beyond. And I think there needs to be a little bit more focus in terms of what are the motivations here. We saw the big, beautiful bill go through quite recently, and we can see that that does increase the deficit for the US. So part of this tariff noise is actually with a reason. It's going to, Trump administration is looking for some revenue there, but it's not going to be a complete offset. But, you know, perhaps the market is being a little bit too complacent in terms of how much of these tariffs will actually filter through.
How do you see the U.S. economy panning out in the second half of this year? And how growth additive will this spending bill, this tax bill, rather, actually be to the U.S. economy?
Yes, I think in terms of the growth outlook, there'll be a small boost over the coming 5 years. But ultimately, it's, you know, there will be some filter through from taxation, but there is also going to be a stagflationary impact more near term coming from the tariffs. So it's very difficult to see how these tariffs do not filter into prices. We already saw earlier in your report that S&P earnings have been downgraded. There is expected to be a profit squeeze. So all of this put together, we are expecting that over the course of the next 6 months or so, there will be some impact filtering through into the data. We're not seeing it in the labour market just yet. There's still some resilience there. But the details, if we look at, you know, unemployment rate went down, but that was really because of migration and because of labour force participation. Private payrolls growth was a little bit weaker. But overall, it's still looking very resilient. It's not enough to show the Fed whether there's the timing for the next cut. We don't think there's going to be a cut in July now, considering all of the tariff noise that we've seen recently. These tariffs are likely to filter through over time. We're not seeing it just yet, but there is some signs in the earnings reports, some signs in the surveys that this will filter through, but most likely from the summer onwards. So next week's CPI probably still quite subdued, but looking beyond that, we should start to see the inflationary impact really starting to creep through. There have been a few delays because of inventories being built up, but we've had the sales recently, and some of those inventories are likely to have been cleared out. So it'll be interesting to see what happens from July or August onwards. We might start to see something more material in terms of the inflation impact.
Sree, another potential wild card that has emerged once again over the weekend, Trump's criticism of the Fed chair. Yesterday, he said if the Fed chair, Jerome Powell, stepped down, that would be a good thing. A report out on the terminal this morning saying that Trump and his allies are stepping up criticism of the Fed chair over renovation. So they're really looking for some catalyst here. If he were forcibly removed from his role, and I'm not saying it's going to happen, but if it did happen, how do you think the market would respond?
I think there will be that reaction primarily from the bond market. And that's something that has been a disciplining factor for the Trump administration in recent months. And I think that will be quite swift. The lack of central bank independence would be very scary for bond investors. That would really be a signal that interest rate setting would then deviate perhaps from data, or become less predictable, and perhaps less less supportive for the economy. So I know that President Trump is feeling that interest rates could go down a lot swifter, but the Fed really do need to look for their dual mandate concerns, and they need to be considering the stagflationary impacts of these tariffs going forward.
Sree, always good to have you on. Thank you so much. Sree Kochugovindan, a senior research economist at Aberdeen. But up next, South Africa's Cyril Ramaphosa suspends a key ally following corruption allegations. Details next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Joanna Bersachi in Dubai. South Africa's president has suspended the nation's police minister, who's been accused of sabotaging an investigation into political killings in the crime-ridden country. Cyril Ramaphosa also announced a commission of inquiry to investigate the allegations.
In order for the commission to execute its functions effectively, I have decided to put the Minister of Police, Mr. Senzo Mchunu, on leave of absence with immediate effect. The Minister has undertaken to give his full cooperation to the Commission to enable it to work properly.
For more, Bloomberg's Kochugovindan joins us now from Johannesburg. Kochugovindan, just walk us through what the initial allegations against the police minister were, and also why, in the end, he was suspended. Was this a political decision?
Good morning, Jumana. Police Commissioner Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi last Sunday accused the now suspended police minister Senzo Mchunu of interfering in probes into political killings and shielding these killers from justice. This now led to various political parties, including the Democratic Alliance, calling for the president to act on these allegations, which we saw him do last night when he addressed the nation, suspended Mchunu, and announced the Commission of Inquiry to investigate these allegations.
Yeah, you say that the Democratic Alliance, the coalition partner, were the ones calling on this investigation. How much of what is unfolded over the course of the weekend is going to have an impact on Ramaphosa's coalition government now?
So just to add, it's not just the Democratic Alliance that was calling for the president to act, but as the second biggest political party in this coalition government, I think it's important for me to mention them. But I also can't speak objectively on the implications of these allegations on the coalition government. But what we have seen happen is the Democratic Alliance laid criminal charges against Mchunu, and there have been some tension between the two biggest parties in the coalition government, which we have seen lead to the firing of a deputy minister who also happens to be a Democratic Alliance member. The other thing is, I think investors will be paying a close eye on any other happenings that we see further from this.
Yeah. Big one, especially because the coalition in itself is key to some of the political stability in the country. Kochugovindan in Johannesburg, thank you so much. Now, coming up, a win for Turkish President Erdogan as Kurdish militants begin destroying their weapons. More details next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Joanna Bersachi in Dubai. The Kurdish militant group PKK has destroyed its weapons at a ceremony in Iraq's semi-autonomous Kurdish region. It marks the beginning of a disarmament process aimed at ending one of the Middle East's longest-running insurgencies. For more on this, we're joined by our managing editor for the Middle East and North Africa, Onur. And Onur, good to have you with us. This is one of those stories that really is a big deal in Turkey and in the region, perhaps hasn't been given as much international attention with everything else that's going on. But it is a big deal because I remember we were having a conversation back in May with this historic announcement. The militant group PKK said that they were looking to start disarming. And indeed, they've begun the process now.
That's true, they did. A group within the PKK laid down its arms in a well-televised ceremony on Friday. And it said it is a historic development. If it goes through, and from the signs it looks like it will, this will bring to an end an armed conflict that's been going on for 4 decades. That cost tens of thousands of lives and also a huge amount of money and energy to Turkey as well. So in that sense, it is historic. It also has repercussions. It will have repercussions in the rest of the region. Kurds and the PKK in particular are scattered across countries in Turkey, Iraq, Syria, as well as in Iran. And it looks like, you know, a huge part of this armed movement within the Kurdish community in these countries, the PKK, is going to abolish itself at the end of this process, and many of its members will be resettled elsewhere, possibly in the US as well, judging by American official statements over the weekend. So yes, it is a huge deal, both for Turkey and the region.
What does it mean for President Erdogan himself? And coming at a time where, of course, there's been a crackdown on political opponents, Does this bolster his popularity?
So this is a tricky bit. Erdogan has tried this before. This is the single sort of most important development in his efforts over the last 10, 15 years to bring the Kurdish conflict to an end. And yes, it is welcomed by many politicians across much of the Turkish political spectrum. But at the same time, there are a lot of people who are criticizing him for the way that he is chasing this, because much of the plans are not really have not really been transparent, but also this process is coming at a time when there is a widening crackdown on Turkish opposition, including its mayors. So there are a lot of people in Turkey, in the opposition, who are questioning how genuine the so-called democratization process is. On the one hand, Erdogan is trying to bolster his popularity among part of the population, including Kurds, with this initiative. But on the other hand, there has been an unprecedented crackdown on Turkish opposition.
What prompted the PKK to decide to finally put down their arms? Why the change of mind? Have they got something in return?
Well, yeah, they are expecting something in return. But first and foremost, it was PKK's founder and imprisoned leader, Abdullah Öcalan, who made a call. So it's very important for them. But obviously, there are circumstances that surround that call. And I think a big part of the expectation is that there are going to be some legal changes, including constitutional changes that Kurdish militant groups expect from Turkey. And it looks like they are convinced that some of these changes will come through, again, which forms a basis, a part of the criticism that Erdogan is facing, because none of those plans have been made public by Erdogan or his party so far.
Onur, great to have you with us. Really important story for the region. Onur Ant, our managing editor for the Middle East and North Africa. Now, let's turn to markets, take a look at how equity futures are trading as we head into the European Open. And no surprise here, it is a lot of red. S&P futures down 0.4%. European markets also down 0.6%, despite the fact we had a better week for trading last week. But all this on the latest tariff letter and a potential 30% base rate that could be applied to European goods as of August the 1st. I also want to turn your attention to Bitcoin. Take a look at what's been happening in the crypto space. Bitcoin has touched $120,000 for the very first time. So it continues to climb in an environment, I guess, of so much geopolitical uncertainty. But then in the past couple of weeks, it's been really quite pronounced that since the beginning or the end of June, we're up about $20,000, so up about 20%. All right, coming up, the EU plans to engage more with other nations hit by U.S. tariffs as Donald Trump fires a slew of new threats to the bloc. This is Bloomberg. Good morning again. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa, our top stories. Teaming up, the EU looks to join forces with nations hit by President Trump's tariffs while delaying its own countermeasures against the United States to allow more time for talks. Equity futures retreat in a cautious start to the week after Trump's latest tariff ultimatums, including 30% on the EU and Mexico. And South African President Cyril Ramaphosa suspends his police minister, launching an inquiry into allegations of sabotage and a probe of political killings. It's just gone 8:30 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Joanna Versace in Dubai. Happy Monday, everybody. Not such a happy Monday for equity markets, though. S&P futures trading in the red as we kick off the week. It's going to be a big week for the U.S. Tariff threats aside. It is going to be the start of the second quarter earnings season. We were talking about this earlier on the show, but Wall Street are expecting the lowest EPS growth year on year since June 2023. So it is a low bar for, I would say, upward surprises. Also, pay attention to U.S. CPI that's coming out this week, and of course China GDP coming out in the next 24 hours as well. So plenty to get through. This is the mood board, though. S&P futures trading down 0.4%. European markets down 0.6% after that tariff news from the weekend. A potential higher baseline rate for the EU of 30% as of August the 1st. 10-year yield sitting at 4.41. We are up 7 basis points on Friday, traveling north in line with some of those other longer dated yields around the world as well, including JGB JGB yields as we get to those upper house elections. So pay close attention for that for anyone who's focused on the price action in Japan. And then Brent is actually trading above $70 this morning. We are 0.2% firmer. It actually was a good week for Brent. Remember, last week I was in Vienna around the OPEC seminar. We were talking about the larger putback of all of these oil barrels to the market. The market took it in their stride. Brent is trading at around $70 now. And just one thing on those Wall Street expectations, I just want to show you, because visual representation always speaks more, at least to me. You can see how much analysts have downgraded their forecast for earnings growth going in to this quarter, which is quite substantial. Look at the March 2025 number. That came in around 13% year-on-year EPS growth. Now, earnings are projected to rise just to around 2.8% as you think about also the potential impact that tariffs could have on margins and more of that business uncertainty that is beginning to weigh on businesses. So keep an eye out for that as we start making it through the season. Now, China's June trade numbers have come in surprisingly strong. Exports in U.S. dollars grew 5.8% on the year, topping Economist expectations. For more, let's bring in our China correspondent, Minmin Lo. So first, trade data today, and then tomorrow we get GDP data. But the export numbers from China suggesting some strength. How much of that is to do with the fact that there was sort of a détente or somewhat of a détente reached between the U.S. and China around Geneva and the Geneva framework?
Yes, definitely a lot to do with that, because you look at the high-frequency data, we already see exports rebounding starting from late May onwards. Of course, mid-May was when we see the two sides reaching that détente, the temporary trade truce, and there you can see on the screen 5.8% is the actual increase in exports in June, beating estimates of 5%. Imports as well up 1%, beating estimates of 0.3%, and the imports number in particular quite significant as well, because this is the first positive print that we had gotten since February of this year. The officials at the press briefing earlier this morning were saying that the expansion in domestic demand helped bolster imports as well. But as you said, a lot of it is because of the temporary trade truce. Looking ahead to August 1st, when the levies for many other countries will start to kick in, especially for countries like Vietnam that has imposed this 40% tariffs on transshipment, that will be a downside risk for many Chinese exporters. Another thing to note, we also got the full first half year data out for trade, and if you break down by geography, we have the data of exports to the US in the first half of the year down almost 10% in yuan terms, imports as well down 7.7%. So you can see that trade with the US is really negatively impacted because of those tariffs, but still overall numbers, you look at trade exports for first half of the year, still pretty strong, and that shows that the economy really showing some resilience with these exporters finding alternative markets outside the U.S. to send their shipments to for now.
Yeah. Interesting to note that the diversion of some of those trade exports. Let's just pick up on some of the takeaways from your week last week. We spoke to you when you were in Kuala Lumpur. The U.S. Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, was there. He met with the Chinese Foreign Minister, Wang Yi, late in the day on Friday. What were some of the key takeaways? And could this actually set up to be a precursor, perhaps, between the two leaders, Trump and Xi?
Yes, Marco Rubio did say that perhaps Trump and Xi will meet later this year, although he didn't put a time on it. Both leaders said that the meeting between them was constructive. China said that it was a pragmatic meeting and said that both sides had agreed to strengthen communication across all levels to manage some of their differences and to deepen cooperation. But really beyond that, we didn't get a lot of details in terms of the substance of the discussion, aside from what Marco Rubio said about that potential meeting. Have a listen.
The odds are high. I think both sides want to see it happen. Obviously, we have to build the right atmosphere and the right deliverables so that a visit isn't just a visit, but it actually has some takeaways from it that are concrete. But there's a strong desire on both sides to do it. The president wants to do it. The Chinese side wants to see it happen. President Xi said that publicly. So I think the odds are high. I don't have a date for you, but I think it's coming. It'll happen.
So he was also a little bit vague, right? He said both sides are trying to work towards having the right atmosphere. They do want to have concrete deliverables to time for that meeting so that both leaders, when they meet, they will be able to announce something. Of course, the biggest sticking points between the two sides is the trade issues. That's something that Marco Rubio doesn't actually have a lot of power in deciding in. We know Scott Bessent will be meeting with his Chinese counterparts in the coming weeks. And really, August is that date we want to look for. If, some economists still believe that there is possibility that tariffs could be raised further. And of course, that is likely something that could possibly derail a potential meeting between Xi and Trump.
Great reporting, as always, China correspondent Min Lo. Thank you so much. Now, the EU is said to be preparing to step up its engagement with other countries hit by Donald Trump's tariffs. It follows a slew of new threats to the bloc and other U.S. trading partners. Let's get more with Bloomberg's Oliver Crock. Oliver, we've had so many discussions over the last few months about the ongoing trade negotiations between the EU and the U.S. They were pushing for that 10% baseline tariff rate. Did this letter over the weekend take them by surprise, and the fact that the new baseline rate could actually be 30%?
I think it would take a lot to surprise anybody from what they get from Donald Trump at this rate. But yes, that is sort of the case, Germana. We got this letter from President Trump, and it really effectively changed the goalposts. And just to reiterate a little bit, kind of because it's easy to get lost in what the percentages are, what the dates are. Initially, the Trump administration was threatening 50% tariffs on August 9th. It's now 30% tariffs, so lower, but on August the 1st. And in this letter that we got from President Donald Trump over to the EU, saying that basically they demand a total reduction to tariffs to basically zero. And remember, this is what the EU has always wanted, zeros for zero tariffs, but that's not all the Trump administration wants. They're also wanting to target these non-tariff barriers. They also went on to say, Donald Trump said, if for any reason you decide to raise your tariffs and retaliate, then whatever the number you choose to raise them by will be added to that 30% figure. So that sets out the stakes for Donald Trump and how he sees the negotiation with the Europeans, which we can imagine is not going particularly well, given that he's now ratcheting up the pressure. Von der Leyen, for her part, responded over the weekend saying that we remain ready to continue working towards an agreement by August the 1st. And at the same time, we will take all necessary measures to safeguard EU interests, including the adoption of proportionate countermeasures if required. So, Jumana, what we got from the Europeans is initially this sort of acceptance that 10% baseline tariff rate. Basically, they were all willing to swallow that, though there was some debate about that moving forward. Now the question is, are they willing to accept 30%? And if they are not willing to accept that, which I think would be very tough to swallow for many of the countries here, there is going to be a conversation about retaliation. Yeah. And that is a conversation that is happening today in Brussels among trade ministers that are getting briefed on the state of negotiations and then what the countermeasures are going to start looking like for the United States if these measures do, in fact, go forward on August the 1st.
So, Ollie, one of the most read stories on the terminal this morning is about Europe looking to work with other partners who've also been subjected to tariffs or tariff threats under the Trump administration. Does that give us an idea of what a potential response could look like? Could there be a sort of global coordinated response to these tariffs?
So, Jumana, I think this is a very interesting long-term conversation. So I think you really have to think about it in three ways. There is the initial response, right, which is retaliation. We know that the EU has lined up basically 100 billion euros worth of goods that they're targeting to the United States. That would be the immediate retaliation. The second part is building other trading relationships across the world. This is something the EU has talked a lot about. There is that relationship with the Mercosur, with Latin America. That is a trade deal that has made a lot of progress. There is now, over the weekend, the leader of Indonesia, who was in Brussels, they signed a political agreement about getting a free trade relationship and a much more open trading relationship with a very large nation. That is the other step forward. But then this is the key question, Jumana. In the absence of American leadership and basically the American withdrawal from all of these multilateral organizations and concepts that we've thought about for many decades as the anchor for the geopolitical order across the world, what does that look going forward? And we understand now that we're hearing from a number of different member states within the European Union that are pushing having more possible coordination among some of these nations that have been hit by tariffs from the United States. So the question is really going forward, and this is what we're going to flesh out this week speaking to finance ministers, is what concretely does that look like? What does a sort of G7-1, G6 look like, this coordination between, say, the European Union, the Japanese, the South Koreans in dealing with the United States? Of course, the United States would see this as a sort of radical escalation, so there's a lot of risk attached, but this is going to be one of the key conversations going forward, Jumana.
Ollie, so fascinating to see what happens in the next couple of weeks. Bloomberg's Oliver Crook in Johannesburg today and this week. Well, coming up, President Trump says the U.S. will deliver Patriot missiles to Ukraine. More on Trump's shift in weapons policy with Kyiv next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersechi in Dubai. President Trump says the U.S. will send more Patriot air defense batteries to Ukraine, which Kyiv says are needed to protect against Russia's ongoing airstrikes.
I haven't agreed on the number yet, but they're going to have some because they do need protection. But the European Union is paying for it. We're not paying anything for it, but we will send it. It'll be business for us, and we will send them Patriots, which they desperately need.
This comes as Axios reports Trump will also announce a new plan to arm Ukraine as soon as today. Let's get more with Bloomberg's Balazs Benz. Balazs, good to have you with us. This seems to be a bit of a change of heart out of the Trump administration, not least because earlier this year he'd ruled out the possibility of sending further military equipment, further shipments, and actually at some point there was a military pause. How significant is it that he's now approving the use of these Patriot missiles? Patriot air defense system, rather, sorry.
Well, we know that Ukraine has been under increasing pressure, both along the front line and deeper in the country because of the massive airstrike that Russia has been carrying out. So where the Patriots can help is obviously with air defense. And it's significant because these are some of the most sophisticated systems in the world. There are only about 200 of them in existence. And the U.S. has recently sounded like they were getting concerned about their own supplies being depleted. So the fact that Trump is willing to send these systems to Ukraine is a very important message both to Ukraine and to Russia as well.
What do you think has changed in President Trump's mind? At the beginning of the year, it seemed like he was almost warming up to the Russian president's point of view. He was very critical of President Zelensky. And yet in the last few months, his tone has softened and perhaps he's moved towards being more supportive of Ukraine. Talk us through this evolution.
Yeah, it's very interesting. We have seen that in recent weeks, President Trump has been growing more and more frustrated with President Putin. And if we look back at the recent announcement of a halt in weapons shipments to Ukraine, that preceded his phone call with Putin, which now in retrospect looks like it didn't go very well. Last week there was also an important meeting between Secretary of State Rubio and Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov, and by all accounts that was a pretty tense exchange as well. So now it looks like Trump is willing to go ahead, and the question now becomes how far is the U.S. willing to go? We have seen reports that there might be more announcements coming on that front, maybe even as soon as today. We will have to see whether that will concern further weapons shipments or perhaps a massive sanctions package that's been working its way through Congress.
Yeah, well, Trump has been teasing this major announcement on Russia today. So let's see what comes out of that. I think there's plenty of speculation that there may be a new package of sanctions announced. So something to watch out for. Balazs Benz in Hong Kong, thank you so much for the reporting. Now for a look at some of the other stories we're following. President Trump says talks are ongoing over Israel's conflict in Gaza, and he hopes for progress this week, even as ceasefire negotiations in Doha stall.
Gaza, we are talking, and hopefully we're going to get that straightened out over the next week. Let's see what happens.
Meanwhile, Gaza's civil defense agency says Israeli airstrikes on Sunday killed more than 40 Palestinians, including children, at a water distribution point. A UN official says a ceasefire is urgent as 90,000 women and children are suffering from malnutrition. Iran's foreign minister says the U.S. is trying to restart nuclear talks, but stressed his country is in no hurry to engage. Abbas Araghchi said in televised remarks that Iran had received multiple messages and is weighing options. He added that Iran needs guarantees it won't be attacked again if the talks don't succeed. Meanwhile, Araghchi will be visiting China on Monday for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. French President Emmanuel Macron is promising a new and historic effort to increase defense spending. He said in a speech that he will double the annual defense budget to $75 billion by 2027, which will require increases of around $4 billion in the next 2 years. Macron says the move seeks to counter an acceleration of threats to freedom in Europe and the risk of outright war in the coming years. NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang says the U.S. government doesn't need to be concerned about the Chinese military using U.S. technology to improve their capabilities. Huang told CNN that China will avoid the technology because it can't be relied upon and may be limited at any time. Chinese military adoption is one of the key concerns Washington has in putting increasing restrictions on tech exports to the rival. And an initial report on the Air India flight that crashed last month says fuel supply to both engines was switched off a few seconds after takeoff. The Boeing Dreamliner crash killed all but one of the 242 people on board. The report does not reveal why the fuel switches were moved to a cutoff position, nor who did it. But a voice recorder transcript shows one pilot asking the other why the switch was moved, and the other pilot denying they did so. Coming up, Donald Trump seeks a deal with West African leaders to deport undocumented migrants. All the details next on that story. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. Liberia's president says the U.S. government has asked some African nations for help with efforts to deport asylum seekers. The matter was discussed at a summit of African leaders at the White House last week. Bloomberg's Ondir Ganga joins us now. Ondir, we were talking about the Africa summit at the White House last week. And of course, this topic came up. How far along are talks right now between the U.S. and African leaders to receive deported immigrants?
Hi, Jumana. So if I just take you back to the press briefing that President Donald Trump and African leaders had, he was the judge, the jury, and the executioner. African leaders were laying on the table not only their grievances, but also the potential that the continent held. But behind closed doors, America was sitting on the other side of the table. They had a big ask, and they were asking African leaders to help them take this problem off their hands. They want immigrants sent to African countries and stay there without being taken back to the U.S. until their asylum cases are decided in court. And the Liberian president was also saying that it's not forceful, it's just the U.S. saying that there are people who have overstayed their visas and are causing problems in the country. However, President Donald Trump is not helping his case. He has previously used very unsavory language to describe some of the immigrants that they want to send on the African continent. And this has raised a lot of questions about this process and the nature of people that they want to bring on the continent. And it's not the first time that they're putting this request to continental leaders in Africa. They have previously dilly-dallied with this idea to work with Rwanda and bring immigrants here in what would have been similar to the deal that the UK had with Rwanda before the next administration came in and did away with it. They've asked the government of Libya and Tripoli to take some of the immigrants, which said no. And the latest country to be asked was Nigeria. About 200 Venezuelan immigrants are to be sent to the country. And the country said, no, we are a big population, over 200 million people. We have enough challenges. But then again, Trump is a very shrewd businessman. There are tariffs on the table. There are visa restrictions. For example, Nigeria, it has gone down from 5 years to 3 months single entry, 14% tariffs. So he's likely to use some of these tools to ensure that he strikes some of these deals in case diplomacy and a velvet handshake will not work.
Yeah, so using economic tools at his disposal. You know, all of this reminds me of the Rwanda plan that the UK government introduced maybe 4 or 5 years ago to send illegal asylum seekers back to Rwanda in exchange for some form of economic commitments. But ultimately, it never got up and running, and the program was sort of put aside by the new Labour government. What is the chance of success with the U.S. reaching agreements with some of these African nations?
Jemana, the chances of success are very slim. Just judging from the Rwanda process, which was slightly more well-organized, more well-thought through, more planned than what we are seeing between U.S. and African countries. Yet there are still bottlenecks. This is a process that has to go through the legislative process. It then escalates to the judicial process. And we saw the UK court put a halt to this. The next administration came in and said that financially, economically, it doesn't make sense. And even morally, it's just deeply wrong. However, morals have not been the stronghold of this administration. But there are checks and balances in the US. These are cases that are going to be taken to court, and there are going to be injunctions to stop these deportations until some things are placed in order. There have been already big mishaps when it comes to these deportations. People have been taken to countries where they don't belong to. Some immigrants have been brought to the African continent, yet they're not even African, or they don't belong to the African countries that they had been taken to. So for this to work, the US will need patience and go back to the drawing board, and that's not the direction that President Donald Trump is moving, and hence that limits their chances of success for this project.
Yeah, wow. Just as you say, it is pretty astonishing that we are having these discussions once again with the African nations, especially also geographically how far away the two continents are situated. Bloomberg's Nziriganga in Kigali, Rwanda. Thank you so much for that reporting. Okay, let's go back to talking about the impact these tariff letters are having on global markets this week. We're setting up to a negative session, S&P futures down 0.5%. But of course, coming back all-time record highs we reached during the week last week, though softening a tad. We do have a big amount of data to get through this week in the U.S., including CPI tomorrow. So you want to watch out for that. It's always a big mover, as well as the beige book coming up later in the week as well. European markets down 0.6%, no doubt in reaction to the possibility of a much higher baseline tariff rate of 30% and some questions about some of those sectoral carve-outs that the Europeans have been pushing for. But that was it for our show, Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jemana Bersachi in Dubai. Stay with us for Daybreak Europe. This is Bloomberg.